好，那我们就准备要开始，大家准备好了吗？我们要听一场这个大师的分享。那大家有任何问题，也可以在我们的这个 Slido 提问。那我们稍后再把 Slido 网址给大家。好，那我们4:40罗老师帮我提醒那个。好，那需要权限的伙伴请稍等哦。好，那请所有的伙伴，请大家关闭静音。那我们的龙门老师已经来到会场了。
Okay, and what a day, huh? Now, how's everybody feeling? Exhausted? I certainly hope not, because we saved the best for last. Our next presenter, he led the Scrum Alliance effort to develop the original curriculum for the Certified Scrum Product Owner Training. So he is also the founder of London Scrum User Group and an active member of the London Product Management Community. He's now the leading product management expert, specializing in product strategy, leadership, and agility. And he has pioneered agile product management practices and developed a range of models, methods, and tools to help organizations create successful products. He shares his knowledge through training courses, 4 #1 selling books, popular blogs, podcasts, talks, and a collection of product management tools, including the famous, widely used, you've definitely heard them before or used them before, Product Vision Board and Go Product Roadmap. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to introduce you, one of the brightest stars of the Scrum universe for more than 15 years, our ending keynote speaker of the day, Roman Pichler. Roman, take it away, please.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and lovely to be with you. So let me share my screen with you. So hopefully you can see a title slide that says product roadmaps in Scrum. That's the topic of my talk today. So I'd like to share some tips around how you can use product roadmaps in a Scrum-based setting. And I plan to talk for about 35, 40 minutes, and I think then there'll be a group photo, and then I'm very happy to take your questions and try and answer as many as I possibly can. Now, before I share my tips, how you might want to approach product road mapping in an Agile Scrum-based context, I'd like to share, what I mean by a product roadmap, what a product roadmap is, at least in my view. And in order to do so, I'd like to tell a little story. Now, I believe where you are, so I'm based in the UK, I should say. So I'm based in Europe, I'm based in the United Kingdom. And I believe where you are, the weather is a little bit nicer than it is here today. It's November, and in November in the UK, the weather turns a little bit cold, it turns rainy, it turns grey, the days are getting shorter, so it's becoming more and more wintry. And this time of year, I always start thinking about the next summer holiday. I think about sun, I think about, be nice to go somewhere where it's warm, to recharge the batteries, chill, and in my case, spend time with the family. Now, I was fortunate enough to go away on holiday this year, and I went to an area in Central Europe, in southern Germany, close to the Austrian border, called Tegernsee. And you can see the lake here. So Tegernsee is the name of a lake, and it's also the name of an area. It's an area I'm very fond of, I very much like. You can swim in the lake, you can sail across the lake. There's a ferry that'll take you across the lake. You can go for walks, you can go for hikes, you can cycle. So I took this picture on one of my bicycle rides that I did, and very much enjoyed the holiday, had a great time there. And as we went as a family, it was a lovely time that we spent in the area together. Now, assuming that we'd like to go back there because we had such a wonderful time this year, then it's only natural to me to start thinking about, okay, how could we possibly get to our holiday destination? And I'd use an old-fashioned roadmap, a paper-based roadmap, if I can find one in our house, or I'd use a mapping tool like Apple Maps or Google Maps in order to see what are the route choices. Assuming that we'd like to drive to our holiday destination, that we'd like to go on a road trip. So you can see I'm based in the southeast of the United Kingdom, fairly close to London, and the holiday destination is right in the south of Germany, close to the Austrian border. And in order to get there by car, there are a number of options, a number of route choices that are available to me and that I have to make. The first one is, how do I get from the United Kingdom to France? Should we take the ferry, or should we take the shuttle, the train underneath the channel, underneath the sea? And then should we drive via Brussels and Frankfurt, or should we drive through France via Reims and then Strasbourg? You can also see it's a comparatively long car journey, 13.5 hours roughly. So it might be worthwhile to think about breaks, stops. It might be even worthwhile thinking about booking a hotel in order to break up the journey and be able to stay overnight. So just like, I'd anticipate key options and make some key choices for a car journey, I'd encourage you to do the same thing for your products, for your digital products. So I think it's very worthwhile to do some road mapping, some product road mapping. And so for me, a product roadmap is a plan, and I'd like to say an actionable, realistic, a feasible plan that communicates how a product is likely to grow, how it's likely to develop, how it's likely to evolve over the coming months. And so a time frame I often suggest is around about 12 months. Sometimes that time frame is too big, it's too far out into the future. Sometimes we'll have to extend it, but I'll say a few more words about this later. So it's an actionable plan, and it typically covers several major releases or product versions. So a major release or product version is something like, say, iOS 16, where the changes to a product have typically a noticeable impact to the end users. So there's a difference for the end users. There's a specific benefit that this new software version, this new product offers, or there's a significant impact to the users and the customers. And I'm emphasizing this because product roadmap is different from a release plan or a delivery plan or a project plan. A delivery project or release plan is always focused on achieving a specific goal and getting to a specific release, major release. A product roadmap is more higher level, and it's not focused on a project, but it's focused on a product. And then finally, there are different types of product roadmaps, roadmaps and product roadmaps, as you're probably aware of. So there are technology roadmaps and there are internal and external roadmaps. But I'll focus on primarily internal product roadmaps in this talk. Now, I'm personally quite a big fan of product roadmaps. Probably doesn't come as a surprise as I'm talking about them. But as every tool, a product roadmap has benefits and drawbacks. So I thought I'll share some of those with you. Let's look at the benefits first. The first benefit that I can think of is that a product roadmap offers a continuity of purpose. It allows us to look ahead for more than just the next release or the next product goal. It allows us to cover a longer time frame than maybe just the next 2, 3, or 4 months. And I think that's very useful. It's very useful to understand how the product is likely to evolve from a user perspective. for the stakeholders to anticipate how the product will impact their work and maybe what contribution they'll have to make in order to ensure that the product becomes successful or stays successful, and also for the development team or the development teams in order to be able to make the right technology and architecture decisions. The next benefit I see is that the product roadmap allows us to communicate specific benefits or outcomes the product will offer in the next 12 months, something like acquire more users or increase engagement or increase conversion or increase revenue, reduce cost. And I think, again, that's very beneficial to show why it's worthwhile spending time, money, and energy on developing or progressing this product. And having a longer-term product plan allows us to hopefully create alignment with the stakeholders, assuming that the stakeholders understand the plan and agree with the plan. So ideally, your product roadmap is a shared strategic product plan that helps everyone move together in the same direction. And then finally, and for me, that's a very important point, I find the product roadmap super helpful to direct the product backlog and make the right tactical, the right delivery or execution decisions. And if you set up the relationship, the connection between the product backlog and the product roadmap in the right way, then the roadmap unburdens your product backlog. So it allows you to work with a more focused, a more concise, a shorter backlog, and that tends to be beneficial. So, number of benefits, but as I've already mentioned, there are also some drawbacks. And maybe the biggest drawback is that product roadmaps can have a tendency to be very feature focused. And that's the traditional way to do road mapping and create such a plan, by essentially coming up with a list of features and mapping those features onto a timeline. Now, for me, that's not really a great way to do road mapping. It can create a feature focus. It can create an output and delivery focus. And in the worst case, we just worry about more functionality, or even always more and better enhanced functionality, create a feature factory where all that matters is cranking out more features and better features, but we completely forget why we're building the product and who we're doing it for, what the value is that we want to create with our product. There's also a risk when you work with a feature-based roadmap that it is viewed as a commitment rather than a plan that will change. And the roadmap is based on what we know right now. And as our knowledge changes, as the market changes, as the competition changes, as new trends emerge, we'll have to adapt our plan. And I'll say a few more words about how we can review and update the product roadmap later on. And then finally, again, that's a common mistake in my experience. Roadmaps, it can be driven by individual stakeholder requests, where stakeholders say, I need this feature, and please put this feature on the roadmap, and you must include that feature. And this can lead, in the worst case, to a Frankenstein product, a product that has a very poor value proposition, where it's not really clear why people should use that product or pay for it in one way or another. And it has a horrible user experience, where the features don't really fit together. They don't really make sense. So I think that's, again, something to watch out for. Now, because of those drawbacks, I'm sometimes asked if product roadmaps should be used and can be used in a Scrum-based context, if they're not really at their heart are anti-agile. Personally, I don't think roadmaps are anti-agile. I think it very much depends, and I guess I've already alluded to this, how we use them, how we apply this tool. And here is a nice looking roadmap that I Googled. It's one of the first images that shows up when you go to Google Images and you search for the term product roadmap. Nicely visualized. However, when you take a closer look, it's the pieces of information that are captured on this roadmap, such as single sign-on or Facebook integration or search improvements. then you'll see that these pieces of information all refer to features. They all refer to product capabilities. They don't really tell us what the desired outcome is, what the impact is that we'd like to have with those features, what the benefit is that those features should help create, or what kind of problem those features should help address. So this is a feature-based roadmap. And again, as I said earlier, that is still probably the most common road mapping approach, the most common roadmap format. But particularly in an agile Scrum-based context, I don't think it's a good idea to use feature-based roadmaps. And so my recommendation is don't use them. Don't use feature-based roadmaps in Scrum. So if roadmaps per se can be a helpful tool in order to anticipate the journey we would like to take our products on, but the traditional feature-based roadmaps are bad, well, what kind of roadmaps should we use then? Well, my recommendation is that you use roadmaps in Scrum that fulfill the following 4 qualities or attributes. The first one is use goal-oriented or outcome-based roadmaps. Some people talk about benefit-based roadmaps or themed roadmaps or problem-based roadmaps. It's one of those things in product management that we seem to never be able to agree to use a single term to mean something. So we always have to use competing terms. But goal-oriented, outcome-based, benefit-based, themed, problem-oriented. I mean, these terms essentially are synonymous. They essentially mean the same thing. So don't use a traditional feature-based roadmap, but use goal-oriented ones. And I'll explain shortly what such a roadmap can look like. Make sure your roadmaps are collaborative and you involve the key stakeholders and development team members in creating and updating them. Again, I'll say more about that aspect, that quality shortly. That your roadmap is connected, that you don't just look at it in isolation. And finally, that it is adaptive, that you inspect and adapt your roadmap on a regular basis, just like you inspect and adapt your product backlog. So let me take you through those 4 qualities, starting with the idea of using a goal-oriented or outcome-based roadmap. And to illustrate this concept, I'd like to share my goal-oriented roadmap template with you, the Go roadmap template. Now, if this template resonates with you, that's great. If you don't like it, that's equally great. So I'm not here to sell you this specific template, but just to illustrate what could a goal-oriented, outcome-based roadmap look like, and what kind of information might you want to capture on it? What kind of elements should maybe be present? Now, with any goal-oriented roadmap, the most important element, the most important pieces of information are the goals. And the point here is really to describe the specific outcomes that you want to achieve with your product over the next, say, 12 months, or the specific benefits that should be offered. So think about things like acquiring more users or acquiring new users, increasing conversion engagement, I think I mentioned earlier as examples, or increasing retention, maybe generating revenue or increasing revenue. So those are all sample goals that you might want to use. And a helpful test to see if you've chosen a meaningful, a helpful goal is to ask the why question. So each of those goals that you put on a product roadmap should state why it is worthwhile to develop the product or progress the product. So this is really about describing, characterizing the value that you want to create with your product over, again, the next 12 months or so. And I look at those goals on a product roadmap as product goals. So for me, the goals on a goal-oriented, outcome-based roadmap are product goals in the sense of the current Scrum guide. So you may be aware of the fact that Scrum recently introduced, well, recently is relative, right? 2 years ago, pretty much exactly 2 years ago, the concept of a product goal, which I personally think is a very good idea. And so I'll say a few more words about product goals and how product goals relates to the product backlog a little bit later in my talk. But here, these goals, these benefits, these outcomes on a roadmap, I very much look at them as product goals in the sense of the Scrum guide. What other pieces of information are on there? Date or timeframes is something that I like to include in my roadmaps, certainly when it comes to internal roadmaps that help to coordinate the work of the stakeholders and development teams. Why? Because often there's a trade-off between fully meeting a product goal and doing it on time and on time or within a certain time frame, and ideally also on budget. Of course, in an ideal world, we'd always like to fully meet our product goals on time and on budget. But in reality, often when we deal with digital products, when we deal with software products, that's not possible due to the amount of uncertainty, due to the complexity that we experience that are present. And so we often need to trade off goal attainment and date adherence. And so I think it's useful to think about, are there any expectations around dates or timeframes, or how long might it take in order to fully meet a goal? But when you work with an external, a publicly visible product roadmap, then I'd be very careful when it comes to dates and timeframes. I wouldn't state any specific dates personally. And if I use any timeframes, I'd use just very big coarse-grained timeframes. And then I like to include metrics on my roadmap. Metrics are there to formulate success criteria and help me understand what it takes in order to meet a goal and measure if a goal has been met or not. I think find that really useful. And then you can see I still have selected features here on my goal-oriented roadmap. However, a feature always must serve a goal. So you can't just add a feature to a goal-oriented outcome-based roadmap. There has to be a goal, there has to be an outcome that this feature supports. So that's the first constraint. The second is those features should really be high-level product capabilities. They should be huge, they should be big. No epics, no user stories. What you'd like to avoid is an overlap with the product backlog. You really want to keep the product roadmap and the product backlog distinct as two separate plans, two separate artifacts. And then thirdly, I like to suggest to limit the amount of features per goal to 3 to 5, with a preference for the smaller number. So the idea is just that you sketch the output, the features, the deliverables that might be required in order to meet this goal. Yeah, but you don't want to solutionize, you don't want to think about too much about detailed functionality at this stage. That's done later in the sprints when you build product increments and you collect feedback from users, customers, and stakeholders on those increments. That'll allow you then to make the detailed product decisions. And then finally, if meeting a goal does result in a major release or new product version, you can give it a name here. And so hence there is a name ROI on this template. Now, let's maybe have a quick look how you could possibly apply such a goal-oriented roadmap template. And in order to do that, I'll share a made-up example, a made-up roadmap with you. And this is a roadmap for a healthy eating product that helps people reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. So that's certainly been, it seems to be becoming an ever bigger issue, at least here in this part of the world, in the United Kingdom, that more and more people develop diabetes too. And so, the idea is to offer an app that helps people improve their eating habits. And if that's what we want to do, we want to offer an app, a software product that helps people improve their eating habits and reduce the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Then I'd think about what initially, in order to build a goal-oriented outcome-based roadmap, I'd think about what are the specific benefits that we could offer. And maybe the first benefit, if this is a brand new product, this is a new product that we're offering, the first benefit could be to help the users understand their eating habits and acquire an initial user base. And then maybe the second step could be to help the users improve at least some of their eating habits. And by doing that, grow the user base further. So we have another acquisition related goal here. The third one might be then to help the users get fitter and generate revenue through in-app purchases or possibly a subscription model. And then finally, help users meet their fitness targets and try and retain users. So there are a number of things that we can observe here. The first one is when it comes to goal-oriented roadmaps, I like to really start with the goals. I like to think about what are meaningful ways now to create value for the users and for the business. What kind of user, customer, what kind of business benefits should the product offer? And then I try and sequence the goals, the outcomes that I've identified in such a way that a meaningful narrative is created. And that's what I've done here, right? So there's a logical progression from helping users understand their eating habits to helping them meet their fitness targets. And then thirdly, the way I formulated the product goals here on this roadmap is as compound goals. So they have two parts. They have an end user facing part and a business facing part. Now you don't have to use this format for your goals or for your product goals. It's something that a preference that I've developed over the years, because ultimately a product is a value creating vehicle. It serves to create value for users, possibly customers, and the business. And so I think it's nice to express that here in the goals on our product roadmap. Now, once I've got my goals and I've sequenced them, I've prioritized them in a meaningful way, I'll then start thinking about timeframes. And you can see that I've chosen quarters here on this roadmap. So the idea is to meet those goals in a quarter each. Yeah. So meet the first goal in the first quarter, the second in the second quarter, and so forth. And then I've given those, I've chosen some names here. So the idea is that meeting those goals will result in new product versions. Hence, it talks about version 2, 3, and 4. And the first one is the MVP, the minimum viable product, the initial public offering of my product. There are also some features. But as you can see, those features are, first of all, huge. They're very coarse-grained. So when you look at the features associated with the very first goal, healthy eating dashboard doesn't talk about any details or what specific information the dashboard should offer. It just says, well, we'll probably need a healthy eating dashboard. And similarly, integration with smartwatches and fitness devices doesn't really talk about what specific smartwatches and fitness devices will be able to integrate with. And the reason for that is to give us some room to wiggle, to experiment in the sprints and find out what is possible, given the constraints, the time and budget constraints that we have, and also what makes most sense, what is most important for the users. So this goes back to the point that I was trying to make earlier. Don't solutionize in your product roadmap. Don't try to anticipate the details of your product, but have the courage to keep them really coarse-grained here and only provide a very rough sketch. And then the details, they'll emerge as part of your sprint-based development process. And then finally, there are some metrics here. Well, I should say most of those are placeholders for metrics and have to be applied, have to be instantiated. But the measurement for the first goal is probably okay, be in the first top 15 diabetes apps 6 weeks after launch. So again, the question here is, how do we know that we've met the goal, or how can we measure that we will have met the goal? So the metrics help you formulate or stipulate a target. So that's what I've done here, and also a time frame when that target should be met. And that's again a preference that I've developed that allows me to keep my goals easy to understand. And then I add some targets and more details here in the metrics section. So that's an example of how you can use a goal-oriented outcome-based roadmap, or how you can build one. And for me, this roadmap would probably be good enough to start now working on the MVP and kick off the first sprint. Now we've got a goal-oriented roadmap in place. That's nice, but the most beautiful, the most amazing roadmap is not very useful if the people who are meant to work with the plan, who are meant to follow the plan, don't understand it, or don't think it's right, and don't agree with it. So rather than the Scrum product owner, the person in charge of the product, creating the roadmap on their own, maybe locked away in their office, I think it's a better practice to bring the right people together. Who are the right people? It's the Scrum product owner, of course, development team representatives, depending on how many development teams you use. If you use one development team, then you can maybe involve all the development team members. If there's several development teams, it's usually best to work with representatives and ask those development teams to send some of their members to a collaborative road mapping session. And then I'd also invite key stakeholders. And key stakeholders are those stakeholders whose expertise and support you need in order to make the right product decisions and progress the product effectively. So for a commercial, a revenue generating product, that might be somebody from marketing, sales, support, and maybe finance. Yeah. And then I'd also add the Scrum Master here. Why? Well, you know, as beneficial as it can be to bring the right people together. And when I say bring the right people together, I literally mean bring them together in form of a collaborative workshop, a collaborative road mapping workshop. And that might be online, it might be on site, but so that people hear each other's perspectives, they hear each other's ideas and concerns, and they can understand each other, right? So I think that's very powerful, rather than the Scrum product owner facilitating that conversation by going from person to person to person. So really try and encourage direct interaction here and encourage people to engage. But of course, if people don't know each other, if people don't trust each other, if people aren't familiar with teamwork and collaborative decision making, then there's a danger that the highest paid person opinion, the hippo, wins, and that the most senior stakeholder makes all the decisions. And that wouldn't be right. It also wouldn't be right that you try and please everyone and agree on the smallest common denominator. And essentially that would mean making weak compromises. But a successful product is not built on weak decisions. So it's important that you facilitate this meeting well. It's important that you ensure that everybody has an opportunity to speak, and everybody is heard, but nobody dominates. And in order to do that, I think what needs to happen is the Scrum product owner needs to lead the road mapping effort and actively contribute and make sure that the right product decisions are being made. And I'll say about the empowerment piece in a second. And the Scrum Master facilitates. The Scrum Master ensures that maybe there's some ground rules that are being followed, that there's a clear decision rule that is being used, such as consent. That means a decision is made if nobody has any meaningful objections. So get your Scrum Master into those collaborative road mapping workshops and ask your Scrum Master to facilitate so that if you're the product owner, you can focus on making the right product decisions or making sure that the right product decisions are being made. The reason that I've added empowered here as a quality for the Scrum product owner is that I believe that ultimately in a Scrum context, the product owner should own the roadmap. So it's super helpful to leverage the collective knowledge of the development teams and stakeholders. And often as product people, we can't make the right product decisions without the input from the development teams and from the key stakeholders. We just need their knowledge, we need their expertise. It's also super helpful to ensure that there's a shared understanding, that everybody knows what those product goals mean, and people don't have different ideas and don't sort of have different interpretations. Everybody's on the same page. And thirdly, by involving people in making product decisions, you increase the chances that people actually support your roadmap and not just pay lip service. Support your roadmap and work towards those goals, implement the plan. However, it's not always possible to achieve consensus or agreements. And if you can't reach agreements, even though you've tried, then I believe the Scrum product owner has to be empowered to make a decision. And so another way to say this is the Scrum product owner has the final say. So again, The best product roadmaps I find, or effective product roadmaps, are created as part of a team effort, not only by the Scrum product owner, but together with the help of the team development team representatives and the key stakeholders. The final thing I'd like to say about this slide is I call this group of individuals that you can see here, that I've depicted here on the slide, a product team. And there's an overlap of the product team with the Scrum team, but you can think of the product team as an extension of the Scrum team that now includes the key stakeholders. And there's a reason that I use the term team. So ideally, I would suggest you'd like to keep this group of people fairly stable so that people can get to know each other and that people can build trust. That'll make future road mapping sessions more productive and more enjoyable, and it will speed up the decision-making process. So we've talked about goal-oriented roadmaps in Scrum. We've talked about collaborative roadmaps in Scrum. Next is the idea of connecting your roadmap. And so it would be a mistake to look at your roadmap in isolation or treat it as a completely isolated plan. I think it's particularly valuable in a Scrum context to understand how is your roadmap connected to the product backlog and to the detailed decisions, to the detailed product decisions that you've captured in your product backlog, maybe in form of epics and user stories. So here's our product roadmap, and I've already introduced the concept of a goal-oriented roadmap and some of the elements that it may contain. And here's our product backlog. And traditionally, a product backlog describes the outstanding work required in order to develop a product or progress a product. So pieces of functionality, maybe also UX design elements. And so you'd get maybe epics and user stories in a product backlog, workflow diagrams, and maybe user journeys, maybe sketches, mockups, and non-functional requirements, NFRs. Now, if we now have two separate plans, a product roadmap and a product backlog, what's the relationship? How do we get from the roadmap to the backlog and from the backlog back to the roadmap? Well, for me, the connection is fairly straightforward. For me, the product roadmap and the product backlog are synced, are connected through the product goal. So I literally take the next product goal from the product roadmap and I copy the goal into the backlog. Now, that has the following benefit, that the goal now connects those two plans, but also the product goal helps me determine the right product backlog items. So the idea in Scrum is, at least in the current version of the Scrum guide, that your product backlog is goal-oriented, that it is directed and focused by a product goal. Now, personally, I think that is a great suggestion. I've seen many huge product backlogs over the past 20 years with hundreds and thousands of product backlog items. And a backlog that is that big usually is simply not manageable. And particularly as long as there's uncertainty and change, as long as you want to innovate your product, you need a product backlog that is concise, that is short and sweet. And by focusing the content of your product backlog on a single product goal, you achieve a comparatively focused, a comparatively concise and short backlog. So for me, that's something good. And so the idea is you copy that product goal into the product backlog, and then you literally remove all items that do not help meet this goal. You remove them, which means you delete them or you archive them. And then if you have features on your goal-oriented roadmap, you can copy them across. You think about, are there any other features that have to be implemented as far as you know at this point in time in order to meet the product goal? And then you start breaking some of those features down into epics. You prioritize your backlog, and then you get the high priority items ready for the upcoming sprint. And that's then the connection. Yeah. So for me, the product roadmap comes first, the product backlog comes second. You could say that the product roadmap establishes the context for making the right product backlog decisions. And I look at the product roadmap as a strategic plan that is really there to guide the stakeholders and development teams, whereas the backlog for me is a tactical plan, a tactical product plan. And for me, the primary beneficiaries of the product backlog are the development teams and the product owner. for stakeholders, the product backlog is often too detailed, too volatile, too changeable to be really useful to work with. It doesn't mean that stakeholders shouldn't see the backlog. I mean, the idea in Scrum's always been that anybody can view the product backlog. There's transparency. But again, as a plan, I usually find that the product roadmap is more helpful for the stakeholders. But of course, it's not only a top-down relationship. You also have to ensure that any bigger changes in the product backlog are reflected in your product roadmap. And in order to do that, you have to adapt your roadmap on a regular basis. And so how often you do that depends on two factors. It depends on how much uncertainty and change there is with regards to your product and the market. So if you have a young product or product that is significantly changing in a dynamic, changeable market, then you may have to review the product roadmap on a monthly basis. So you essentially do an inspect and adapt on the roadmap in addition to your product backlog. But if there's more stability, then usually quarterly reviews are sufficient. And if there's a lot of stability, you might get away with reviewing the product roadmap every 6 months. So if you're not sure, I suggest you start with quarterly reviews and then adapt the cadence, the frequency, either increase it or decrease it. And again, perform a roadmap review together with the key stakeholders and development team representatives. So you leverage their knowledge, you make sure there's a shared understanding, and you maximize the chances that people support the plan. Now, when it comes to reviewing the roadmap, there are two factors, in fact, three factors you should look at. The first two are any bigger product backlog changes driven by user feedback, and then the development progress. If that progress is significantly slower or faster, it can have an impact on the roadmap, just like bigger product backlog changes can have an impact on the product goal, which then again typically has an impact on your roadmap. And then the third one is if there are any changes in the overarching product strategy, and typically that also requires a roadmap adjustment. So again, the roadmap is a living plan. It's not a fixed plan, but it's a strategic product plan that needs to be inspected and adapted. And as the market changes and as your knowledge about how you can best meet the user and customer needs changes. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions shortly. You can find more information on product roadmaps and download the little template I showed you on my website. And I recently published the second edition of my book, Strategize. So if you'd like to read up more on agile product road mapping practices and go a little bit deeper, you may find it helpful to take a look at this book. So again, thank you very much.
Okay, let's take this photo op time. Let's take a group photo together. I'm gonna need 30 seconds of your time. And导播还是哪位要做拍照的动作？
我来，来，我们来一起大合照，请大家打开镜头。好，那也请这个志工团队帮忙。来，导播今天最会的就是拍照了。来，1、2、3，我来拍第一张哦。那有参加这个纪念品任务的伙伴，那也记得自己拍照哦。那我拍第二张，请大家打开镜头，那关闭静音。那请大家继续把问题写在 Slido。那也记得帮这个 Slido 的问题按赞，因为我们可能没有办法回答每一个问题。那我想我们学敏捷就是要能够用上敏捷，所以请大家帮问题做价值的排序。那赞数越多的越有可能会被回答到。好，那我现在要拍第4张。好，我现在要拍第5张。好，我们还有最后一张。那柳丁老师交给您分享 Slido 的画面。
Okay.
Yeah. So Roman, thank you so much. We're done with the photo. So I think will bring up the questions, and we'll try to translate the Chinese one, but just hang on for a second there.
You guys see? Jerry, you want to drive?
Sure. So well, hang on. I can't actually see the questions, but I can read it out. So David asked a question. So how do you convince the team to use other product roadmaps if they are comfortable with using the feature-oriented roadmap?
Yeah, that's a nice question. Thank you for asking it. I mean, if you are super happy with your current road mapping approach, then I guess there's no reason to change it. And feature-based roadmaps can work well when there's a lot of stability, when you have a product that doesn't change significantly. Maybe it's a mature product, that'd be a product that's been typically around for quite some time. And the market is comparatively stable as well. So if that's the situation you're in, then yeah, I mean, feature-based roadmaps might work for you, and it may not be worth changing. But that's not really the ideal context to apply Scrum. Scrum is a framework that was developed to help develop complex products.
Yep.
So those are products where you have a lot of change, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of innovation, a lot of risk. And in that context, a feature-based roadmap, I don't think is particularly helpful. It simply anticipates what the product should look like and do in too much detail, typically too much in advance. There's a danger that it overlaps with the product backlog, and that makes the roadmap more volatile, requires more work to adjust the roadmap. And then those features are often seen as a commitment. And people think because that feature is on the roadmap, that's what will get implemented, and that's what the product will look like, that's what it'll do. So those are a number of reasons why I've come to have a strong preference for working with goal-oriented, outcome-based product roadmaps. So you could say modern product roadmaps, and I think that's largely agreement in the product management community, at least with people who think more about product road mapping practices and try and evolve them. I think there's a large agreement that that's the way we'd like to progress.
That is a great answer. I mean, definitely trying to use a goal-based approach to manage uncertainties and VUCA, right? So what you're saying is, with the feature-based, it's great for, I guess, very stable, very simple. I guess there's less uncertainties with your output as opposed to the outcome. Then sure. So I hope that I think that answers that question beautifully. Now we've got a question from Herdy. So Herdy says that they are currently using user story map and also learning how to use the product roadmap. He feels that there's quite a bit of similarity, and they're thinking about when to use which, right? So could you please provide your experience on your take on which one to use, and also and I guess from product owner's perspective, using those in the different time points, where should they be watch out, and what kind of problem they should be watch out for?
Yeah, sure. It's another great question, and there is an overlap between product roadmaps and story maps, depending on how you use story maps. So a story mapping is a technique my colleague Jeff Patton came up with quite a while back. I mean, I think about 15 years back or so. And at its heart, story mapping recognizes that users don't benefit from individual isolated pieces of functionality, but typically what we do is we interact with different pieces of functionality or features in order to get a job done.
Yep.
And so story maps allow us to literally connect stories and describe a user journey or part of a user journey. So they can be very useful, and you can think or you can use user journeys as an alternative to a traditional linear product backlog where traditionally you have the high priority items at the top and the lower priority items at the bottom. The user stories, they flow from left to right, and again they try and model a user journey or part of a user journey or a user workflow. And then there's something else you can do with user maps, and that is that you can not only try and describe what you're focusing right now, but also what you'll do in the future, in future releases. Now, if that's what you do, there'll be an overlap with the roadmaps. But if you focus essentially on the current product goal or the current release, then you can just think of the story map as as I said, an alternative to a traditional backlog, and happily complemented with a goal-oriented, outcome-based roadmap. Yeah.
Awesome.
And that'd be my recommendation.
Thank you for that. Conscious of time, do we have time for another question? Do you think? What do you think?
Oh, Roman, let's do.
I have time. Yeah, I've got time.
All right, everybody, just don't go home. Yeah, just let's go for one more, shall we? So I think this one is definitely quite specific. So your product's not the number one in its market, and your shareholders demand a feature parity, especially sales due to fear not being considered sellable. So leading to a product roadmap that is feature based. How do we overcome this? Roman, did you?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how to best answer the question. It's another great question. Thank you for asking those questions. I think what's worthwhile in order to find the right solution here is really to understand what are the causes. So, what causes the sales team to have concerns? What's really going on here? Sometimes sales teams like feature-based roadmaps because they make it easy then to tell customers about our upcoming features and kind of sell a future product version, right? Or at least kind of, secure commitment, possibly even secure orders at an early stage or renewals at an early stage. And if that was the case, then at least part of the solution is an education of the sales force, and helping the salespeople communicate benefits rather than features to customers and users. But again, I think it's difficult probably for me to provide a detailed, correct, and satisfactory answer in this context. It's probably something where I need to understand a little bit better what's really going on here, what are the real issues, and then what is an appropriate solution. Sorry.
No, don't be. To be honest, like when I hear the answer of the first question, I think you did partially answer this, because if you look at the question, it was actually asking, they're making an assumption that the stakeholder believes that getting feature parity would get them into a position where they can be first, or even and that's a great assumption. And I think that would be something that I feel the product roadmap can help to distinguish, or even bringing in, like you said, the product team to think a bit deeper into, are we going to get there with feature parity, right? So I felt you've kind of answered that question, at least to me. That's my interpretation of that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And maybe if it just can add one more thing to this. I mean, it might also indicate that there's a trust or empowerment issue, because stakeholders, shouldn't really be the people who make decisions how to improve the position of the product or make the product more successful. It should really be the Scrum product owner, together with the key stakeholders and development team members. Those are the people that are responsible for product success, not the stakeholders. It's perfectly okay for the stakeholders to be concerned, but unless the stakeholders are key stakeholders, I wouldn't really see them kind of driving the decisions, to be honest. So, again, there might be potentially quite a few things going on. So it would be worthwhile to really reflect on what are the issues here, the underlying issues, what are the underlying causes, so you can come up with the right improvement measures.
Yep. So the answer is empower your product owners on making decisions and working with your stakeholders. That's a great suggestion. Quite a few more. One more to go, maybe.
Let's do one more.
Okay, let's go one more. So what are the best practices to groom product roadmap in terms of process and frequency? I think you've answered some of those in your slide.
So frequency is maybe easy to start with. As a rule of thumb, review your product roadmap on a quarterly basis. So inspect and adapt your roadmap on a quarterly basis. Now, I've tried to at least allude to it in my talk. If you use a product roadmap, then you have a strategic product plan. And again, I think that can be very powerful, and it can be nicely complement the product backlog. But it also means that you then need a strategic inspect and adapt cycle in addition to your more tactical one on the product backlog. So make sure you regularly review the roadmap and make sure you schedule those reviews well in advance. So you've got them in your calendar and you block the time, you reserve the time to carry them out. You don't deprioritize them. Number one. Number two, the process, bring the right people together. So those are the key stakeholders and development team representatives and as the Scrum Master to facilitate. And adopt a collaborative approach, preferably use a collaborative road mapping workshop. And then look at 3 factors in order to understand if you should change your product roadmap, if there's an opportunity to change it, or if there's a need to change it. Number 1, development progress. Number 2, product backlog changes. Number 3, any changes in the overarching product strategy. And then by product strategy, I mean, has the target group, the market segment changed? Has the product's value proposition changed? Have any standout features changed? Have any overarching business goals changed? So those are the 3 factors that I typically look at. And then just as a final comment, I like to combine product roadmap and strategy reviews because you need the same people. It's a similar review frequency, so you might as well combine those 2 meetings. That just saves you scheduling yet another meeting. So maybe something you want to consider.
Yeah. So frequent
and again,
enough to...
just as a complete plug, then you can find, you can't see it, but I mean, more details honestly are in my book, Strategize. So, I've described those factors, I think, quite nicely in my book. So if you want to go deeper, then maybe check out that book.
Will do. Over to you. I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much. Do we have to go back into the the breakout room?
Wrap things up.
Yep.
Let's open it up.
Cool. So Roman, stay put. We'll be bring you back into the breakout room.
好的，谢谢大家。好，那个老师跟这个在这个 VIP 论。好，那接下来我们就是介绍时间。那接下来我请我们的这个志工我们的这个怡珍来跟大家分享一下怎么申请这个专技的网络的这个平台。那今天早上的场次的这个内容已经上架在专技网络大学的平台。那如果早上错过的伙伴已经可以上去观看了。但是在观看前需要大家先这个来这个申请。好，那我看到 PU 跟这个 Roger 老师，那 Roger 老师有什么要跟大家说一下的吗？那我们怡珍准备一下就来。
不好意思，我们被拉回那个，等下不好意思，我们被拉回那个。
又回来了，你们又回来了。
不知道谁把我们拉回来，不好意思，再等我一下，让我们把那个 Roman 再放回去。
对，不要关 breakout room 好不好？不要关。
没有关，目前没有关
刚刚被关上了。
没关系，
没有。
好，
那你们再回去，目前没有动到。
好，帮我 assign 他们回去好吗？
好，可以。
好。
Roman, I'm going to assign you back. 帮我找 Roman 好吗？
有 Roman 有在。
帮我 assign 回去。